Those twin-engine aircraft thundering across Tokyo's skyline changed everything. The date was April 18, 1942. The time was noon. What happened next would reshape the entire Pacific conflict. Japan had never experienced anything like this moment. Foreign bombers over their sacred homeland. The psychological shockwaves rippled through every level of Japanese society. Military leaders stood paralyzed. Civilians gazed upward in disbelief. The impossible had just become reality. Admiral Yamamoto felt the blow personally. The architect of Pearl Harbor now watched his greatest fears materialize. His chief of staff captured the moment perfectly in his diary entry. Victory belonged to the enemy today. Those words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. The damage statistics seemed almost insignificant. 50 people killed, 252 injured, 90 buildings touched by bombs. Yet these numbers masked the true devastation. Japan's sense of invulnerability had shattered completely. The myth that protected their islands for 6 centuries lay in ruins. One Japanese officer understood the shame so deeply he chose ritual suicide. The responsibility for homeland defense had been his burden. He had failed utterly. Captain Kurashima described how the raid passed like a shiver over Japan. That poetic phrase captured both the brief physical presence and the lasting terror. The morning had started with routine normalcy. Air raid drills proceeded as scheduled. Sirens remained silent. Wardens scanned peaceful skies. Fire brigades moved their equipment through quiet streets. Everything felt like going through the motions. Nobody expected real danger. When the drill ended at noon, life continued normally. Millions of Tokyo residents went shopping. Families visited parks and shrines. Baseball games proceeded as planned. The French journalist in the city heard it first. A rugged, powerful sound of airplane engines. Then came the explosions. The dark airplane traveled incredibly fast at rooftop level. So they've come, he thought. Japanese civilians initially couldn't comprehend what they witnessed. People actually waved at the fast-moving aircraft. Then they noticed the white stars, American markings. Reality struck different witnesses at different moments. Some understood when bombs started falling. Others realized during the anti-aircraft fire. The psychological devastation exceeded all physical damage. Radio Tokyo had repeatedly assured everyone of their safety. The emperor remained protected. The kamikaze mystique still held power. That spiritual fortress hadn't faced serious threats since 1281. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had led 16 specially modified B-25 Mitchell bombers on this impossible mission. Each aircraft carried 4 500-pound bombs. They had launched from USS Hornet, 650 nautical miles from Japan. That distance was 250 miles farther than originally planned. The Japanese picket boat Nito Maru had spotted them at 7:38 a.m. What followed demonstrated American innovation at its finest. Japanese defensive vulnerabilities became glaringly apparent. A chain of events had begun that would lead directly to their first major naval defeat. That defeat would come at Midway just 7 weeks later. The Imperial Japanese Navy had deemed such attacks physically impossible. Their pre-war doctrine was based on rational technical analysis. Carrier-based aircraft were limited to operations within 200 to 250 nautical miles. They needed to return to their carriers. Japanese defensive positioning reflected this assumption completely. Using medium bombers from carriers violated everything they understood. Naval aviation physics made it impossible. The B-25 Mitchell bombers presented overwhelming size constraints. Their 67-foot wingspan dwarfed standard carrier aircraft significantly. The F-4F Wildcat measured only 27 feet. The SBD Dauntless reached 42 feet. At approximately $27,000 to 29,000 pounds loaded weight, each B-25 weighed nearly 3 times more than typical carrier aircraft. Japanese doctrine correctly assessed that such aircraft couldn't achieve carrier launches. Normal takeoff requirements exceeded 800 feet. That distance was far longer than any carrier deck. This assumption proved fatally flawed. American engineers at Eglin Field, Florida, had transformed the B-25s completely. They installed 265-gallon steel fuel tanks in the bomb bays. Rubber bladder tanks were added throughout. 10 5-gallon jerry cans per aircraft allowed manual refueling during flight. Fuel capacity nearly doubled from 670 to 1,189 gallons. Weight reduction came through removing bottom turrets. Radio equipment was stripped out. Unnecessary materials disappeared completely. Wooden guns were installed in tails to deter attacks. Lieutenant Henry Miller developed revolutionary short-field takeoff techniques. These techniques seemed to defy physics completely. Pilots held both feet on brakes with half flaps extended. The stabilizer was positioned back 3/4, maximum manifold pressure built before release. Doolittle's lead aircraft achieved takeoff in just 467 feet. Lieutenant Donald Smith managed an astounding 287 feet later. The 20-knot headwind over Hornet's deck provided crucial assistance. The carrier's forward speed added more airspeed. Together, they made the impossible possible. Japan's defensive calculations had positioned their early warning line based on previous observations. Converted fishing trawlers sat at prescribed intervals. American forces had approached within 200 miles during previous raids on Wake and Marcus Islands. The number 23 Nitomaru that spotted Task Force 16 was positioned 650 miles from Japan. That location was well beyond their expected threat perimeter. Even more critically, Japan possessed no radar systems in April 1942. They relied entirely on visual detection from picket boats. The morning of April 18th had begun with that routine air raid drill in Tokyo. No sirens sounded when it mattered. Air raid wardens gazed at placid skies. Firefighting brigades moved equipment through streets mechanically. When the real attack came, Japanese fighter pilots faced unprecedented tactical situations. The bombers flew much lower than anticipated. They approached at wave-top level before climbing to just 1,500 feet for bombing runs. Some Kai-61 liquid-cooled fighters engaged over Yokohama. These were prototypes so new that American crews mistook them for German Bf-109s. Perhaps most remarkably, Japanese fighter pilots didn't attack aggressively even when encountering raiders. Some failed to drive attacks home to maximum extent. Others mistook unfamiliar B-25 silhouettes for Japanese aircraft. The complete failure of interception efforts was devastating. Despite Japanese claims of shooting down 9 aircraft, they actually destroyed not even one. Naval officer Shigeru Yoshimiya noted this bitter failure. Anti-aircraft batteries fared no better. While gunners judged altitude well, their bursts consistently fell to the right or left. The fire proved intense, but completely inaccurate. Only First Lieutenant Richard Joyce's B-25 received minor battle damage from flak. Admiral Yamamoto's reaction revealed both personal anguish and strategic prescience. Just days before the attack, he had written to Ninua Michi at a geisha house. The thing that worried him slightly was public perception. Although the war had only been going on for something over 3 months, many people felt relieved. They were grateful to Admiral Yamamoto because there hadn't been a single air raid. He warned prophetically that the enemy's absence was no thanks to Admiral Yamamoto. It was thanks to the enemy himself. Following the raid, Yamamoto expressed deep distress. I was distressed to hear that Tokyo finally had a raid, though he added pragmatically that he felt it was just enough of a taste to warn Tokyo's people. Most revealing was his assessment of military failure. It's a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital should have been defiled without a single enemy plane shot down. The raid handed Yamamoto exactly the leverage he desperately needed. Bureaucratic resistance to his Midway plan had been substantial. The Naval General Staff, led by Admiral Osami Nagano, had initially preferred isolating Australia. They wanted to occupy Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. They had dismissed Yamamoto's warnings about carrier strikes on the homeland as unreasonable. American bombers had just proved him absolutely right. The acceleration proved remarkable after the raid embarrassed Japanese leadership. They sped up their debate to attack the U.S. naval base at Midway. Final authorization came May 5th, when Imperial General Headquarters issued Navy Order No. 18. This directed the occupation of Midway and key Aleutian positions. Japan's strategic objectives at Midway directly stemmed from preventing future raids. They wanted to extend the defensive perimeter eastward. Destroying remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet carriers became priority. Capturing Midway as an advance base for homeland defense seemed essential. Crucially, the Aleutian diversionary operation required 2 carriers. Those carriers otherwise would have been used for the Battle of Midway. This weakened Yamamoto's main force at the critical battle. The documented reactions of Japanese military officials reveal an institution struggling to process an impossible event. Admiral Matome Ugaki wrote with unusual directness in his wartime diary. Today, the victory belonged to the enemy. Captain Kurashima Kameto described how the raid passed like a shiver over Japan. This poetic phrase captured both the brief physical presence of bombers and their lasting psychological effect. Naval officers Mitsuo Fuchida and Shigeyoshi Miwa professionally acknowledged the raid as excellent American strategy. The gap between propaganda and reality emerged starkly in official responses. Japanese propaganda immediately claimed thousands of deaths of innocent civilians. Internal military documents found after the war revealed actual casualties. 50 killed, 252 injured, 90 buildings damaged or destroyed. Military claims of shooting down 9 American aircraft, particularly galled officers like Miwa. They knew they had failed to destroy even one. Radio Tokyo's first broadcast came before any American announcement. Enemy bombers appeared over Tokyo for the first time in the current war. Invading planes failed to cause any damage on military establishments. The propaganda machine quickly pivoted to wordplay, dubbing it the Do-Nothing Raid. Emperor Hirohito's involvement, while filtered through formal channels, proved significant. He personally commuted death sentences for 3 of 8 captured raiders. He participated in strategic decisions about retaliation. He ordered the army in China to totally destroy military installations, airfields, and important lines of communication in areas where raiders had landed. The raid's conception began with Navy Captain Francis Lowe's observation at Naval Station Norfolk on January 10, 1942. Watching Army bombers practice over runways painted with carrier deck outlines, Lowe realized twin-engine bombers might launch from actual carriers. Admiral Ernest King embraced the concept immediately. General Hap Arnold selected Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle to lead the mission. Doolittle was a test pilot and aeronautical engineer with a Ph.D. from MIT. He was a master of the calculated risk. Doolittle's selection process at Eglin Field, Florida, began with the 17th Bombardment Group. They possessed the most experienced B-25 crews available. When asked for volunteers for a dangerous secret mission, all 140 men stepped forward. From these, Doolittle selected 24 five-man crews. These were eventually reduced to 16 for the actual mission. The training regimen from February 27th to March 25, 1942, pushed both men and machines to their limits. Pilots practiced short-field takeoffs on painted carrier deck outlines. They achieved consistent launches within 400 feet. Low-level flying over water became routine. Navigation and low-altitude bombing were perfected. The modifications transformed each B-25 into a specialized long-range strike aircraft. Fuel capacity was doubled. Weight was reduced through removal of unnecessary equipment. Each crew consisted of 5 specialists: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and engineer-gunner. Among them were remarkable individuals who would make history. Ted Lawson would write a memoir that became a bestseller. Robert Gray would die in the China-Burma-India theater in October 1942. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, would become the last surviving raider. He died in April 2019 at age 103. The launch sequence on April 18th demonstrated American naval air coordination at its finest. Heavy seas crashed waves over Hornet's bow. Detection forced launch 10 hours early and 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than planned. All 16 aircraft launched successfully between 8:20 and 9:19 a.m. Doolittle led from the front, taking off first with only 467 feet of deck available. The psychological impact on Japan proved devastating beyond all physical damage. Radio Tokyo had assured citizens repeatedly of their safety. The emperor remained protected by divine mandate. Their homeland was secure from enemy attack. The kamikaze mystique had protected them since Kublai Khan's invasion attempt in 1281. That spiritual fortress crumbled in minutes above Tokyo. The 26th Air Flotilla, under Rear Admiral Sueo Yamagata, bore primary responsibility for homeland air defense. The Kisarazu Air Group, based at Kisarazu Airfield in Chiba Prefecture, formed the first line of aerial defense. The flotilla scrambled 29 medium bombers, Mitsubishi G4M Bettys, equipped with torpedoes. 24 carrier fighters with long-range tanks were dispatched to find and sink American carriers. They assumed carriers must be operating within 200 miles of Japan. This assumption proved completely wrong. 2 complete B-25 crews fell into Japanese hands. Their ordeal would expose the brutal reality of Japanese prisoner treatment. Crew number 6, Green Hornet, was piloted by Lieutenant Dean Hallmark. They crashed in the ocean off the Chinese coast after running out of fuel. 2 crew members drowned. Crew number 16, Bat Out of Hell, was under Lieutenant William Farrow. They bailed out over Japanese-occupied territory near Nanchang. The 8 captured airmen were immediately flown to Tokyo for interrogation by the Kempai Thai military police. The documented torture methods were horrific. The water cure forced prisoners to consume up to 5 gallons of water mixed with kerosene and urine. Their abdomens swelled grotesquely. Then guards beat or jumped on their stomachs. The Japanese government created the Enemy Airmen's Act on August 13, 1942, specifically to provide legal cover for executing the raiders. Applied retroactively, it charged them with bombing and strafing civilians. No evidence supported these claims. The August 28 mock trial at Shanghai Police Headquarters denied them any defense. All 8 were sentenced to death. Emperor Hirohito's commutation of 5 death sentences to life imprisonment meant 3 men faced execution. On October 15, 1942, at 4:30 p.m., Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, aged 28, Lieutenant William Farrow, aged 24, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, aged 21, were trucked to Public Cemetery No. 1 outside Shanghai. They were executed by firing squad. Lieutenant Robert Meader died on December 1, 1943, from malnutrition, dysentery, and Beriberi after 20 months in captivity. The four survivors, Chase Nielsen, Robert Hite, George Barr, and Jacob de Chazer, endured 40 months of captivity. This included 34 months in solitary confinement, before American paratroopers liberated them on August 20, 1945. Japan's retaliation against Chinese civilians who aided American airmen ranks among the Pacific War's worst atrocities. Operation Seigo, the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, began May 15, 1942, just 27 days after the raid. It continued until September 4th, devastating approximately 2,000 square miles of Chinese territory. General Shunroku Hata's China Expeditionary Army deployed massive forces. The 13th Army under Lieutenant General Shigeru Sawada and the 11th Army under Lieutenant General Yokoyama Isamu totaled 40 infantry battalions and 15 to 16 artillery battalions. Approximately 18,000 men participated. Most disturbingly, Unit 731 under General Shiro Ishii deployed 150 soldiers carrying biological weapons. These included cholera, typhoid, plague, dysentery, anthrax, and paratyphoid. The human cost defied comprehension. Japanese forces executed 25,000 Chinese civilians for helping American flyers escape. Chinese military casualties reached 724 officers and 23,637 soldiers killed. Additional thousands were wounded or missing. The biological warfare campaign backfired catastrophically. Over 1,000 Japanese troops became infected with their own weapons. 1,700 died primarily from cholera. The systematic destruction aimed to eliminate any possibility of future raids from Chinese bases. Japanese forces launched 131 air raids against Chuchao Airfield alone. This was Doolittle's intended destination. Every airfield capable of hosting B-25 bombers was rendered permanently inoperative. The Doolittle raid's strategic impact fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory through a cascade of consequences. The immediate effect forced Japan to recall 4 Army fighter groups for homeland defense. This occurred during 1942 to 1943, when they were desperately needed in the South Pacific. This represented just the beginning of resource misallocation that would plague Japan throughout the war. The raid's role in accelerating the Battle of Midway proved decisive. By dissolving Naval General Staff opposition and securing Army cooperation for Yamamoto's plan, the raid set Japan on course for its first major naval defeat. The diversion of 2 carriers to the Aleutian operation, specifically to prevent future bomber bases, weakened the main Midway force at the critical moment. When 4 Japanese fleet carriers sank on June 4 to 5, 1942, Japan lost not just ships, but irreplaceable experienced aircrew and the strategic initiative. The psychological transformation proved equally significant. The raid created what American planners called a fear complex that forced inefficient defensive resource allocation for the war's remainder. Japan shifted from an offensive to defensive mindset. They expanded their defensive perimeter beyond sustainable limits. This made supply lines vulnerable to American submarine interdiction. The long-term impact on Japanese military doctrine manifested in multiple ways. The homeland defense priority drew resources from every theater. This contributed to defeats in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. The loss of offensive momentum after Midway, partly triggered by the raid's psychological impact, allowed America to seize and maintain initiative through the island-hopping campaign. Military historians debate whether Midway would have occurred without the Doolittle raid. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully argue in Shattered Sword that while the raid may have been the catalyst, Midway planning predated April 18th. However, they acknowledge the raid's crucial role in overcoming internal Japanese resistance and accelerating the timeline. Mark Steele emphasizes the raid's creation of very inefficient disposition of forces that persisted throughout the war. Among the captured raiders, Jacob DeShazer's story stands as extraordinary testimony to human resilience and transformation. The bombardier from crew number 16 endured 40 months of Japanese captivity. This included torture, starvation, and 34 months in solitary confinement. During imprisonment, a Bible provided for 3 weeks in 1944 transformed his perspective completely. DeShazer emerged from captivity with an astounding decision. He would return to Japan as a missionary. In 1948, just 3 years after liberation, he arrived in Nagoya. This was one of the cities he had bombed. He began 30 years of missionary work. His tract was A Prisoner of Japan, circulated throughout Japan. It reached millions with its message of forgiveness. The tract's most remarkable conversion came when Mitsuo Fuchida read DeShazer's story. Fuchida had led the Pearl Harbor attack. He was struggling with Japan's defeat and searching for meaning. He found himself transformed by DeShazer's message. The two former enemies became friends and fellow missionaries. They symbolized reconciliation between former enemies. DeShazer's fellow survivors took different paths. Chase Nielsen remained in military service, retiring as an Air Force career officer. Robert Hite pursued civilian work while serving in the Air Force Reserve. He died in 2015 as the last surviving POW. George Barr was permanently damaged by his treatment. He was medically retired and struggled with psychological trauma until his death in 1967. The Doolittle raid achieved strategic success far exceeding its planners' expectations. While causing minimal physical damage, it shattered Japanese psychological certainty. It accelerated strategic miscalculation at Midway. It triggered massive retaliation against China. It forced inefficient Japanese resource allocation throughout the war. For the 80 volunteer airmen, the mission extracted a terrible price. 3 died during the raid or escape. 3 were executed. 1 died in captivity. 10 more died in subsequent combat operations. Their sacrifice fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. The technical achievement of launching Army medium bombers from a Navy carrier demonstrated American innovation and inter-service cooperation. This would characterize the Pacific War throughout. The B-25's successful carrier launch overturned Japanese assumptions about what was physically possible. This contributed to a pattern of underestimating American capabilities that would prove fatal. Japanese military leaders understood the raid's significance immediately. Yamamoto's deep distress upon hearing the news revealed institutional recognition. The suicide of Tokyo's air defense commander showed the personal cost. Internal acknowledgments of failure proved that fundamental assumptions about the war had changed. The myth of homeland invulnerability died in those moments over Tokyo. It had been carefully cultivated since the divine wind saved Japan from Mongol invasion in 1281. For America, the raid provided desperately needed proof that Japan could be struck. After months of defeat and retreat across the Pacific, American bombers over Tokyo electrified public morale. The mission validated the calculated risk-taking that would characterize American Pacific strategy. The human dimension transforms military history into human drama. 80 volunteers knew their chances of survival were minimal. Chinese civilians risked everything to save American airmen. Japanese civilians experienced their first taste of the war they had celebrated 4 months earlier. Ted Lawson lost his leg and wrote his memoir. Jacob DeShazer returned to minister in the city he bombed. Richard Cole lived to age 103 as the final witness. These individual stories give meaning to strategic abstractions. The Doolittle raid stands as a masterclass in strategic psychological warfare. It achieved through audacity what conventional military power could not. By violating Japanese assumptions about carrier aviation capabilities, exposing homeland vulnerability, and triggering strategic overreaction, 16 B-25 bombers altered the Pacific War's trajectory. This proved more effective than entire fleet engagements. The raid's true victory lay not in bombs dropped, but in minds changed. Admiral Yamamoto's prescient warning that the enemy's absence owed nothing to Japanese strength proved prophetic. The Naval General Staff's dismissal of carrier strike warnings as unreasonable gave way to panicked overreaction. Each strategic miscalculation traced back to those crucial moments over Tokyo. Modern military strategists study the Doolittle raid as an example of asymmetric warfare, achieving disproportionate strategic impact through psychological effect. The investment of 80 men, 16 modified bombers, and 2 carriers yielded returns that shaped the entire Pacific War. Yet the raid's human cost demands acknowledgement. The Chinese civilians executed in retaliation represent one of history's most disproportionate reprisals. The captured raiders' torture and execution violated every standard of military conduct. These crimes against humanity stand as permanent testimony to the brutal reality behind strategic victories. The transformation of enemies into missionaries offers hope. Deshaiser returning to Japan and Fuchida converting to Christianity suggests that even war's worst horrors can yield reconciliation. Their story demonstrates that while the Doolittle raid changed the Pacific War's military trajectory, its greatest legacy might be proving humanity's capacity for forgiveness. Even after experiencing war's darkest extremes, redemption remains possible. The 16 B-25s that launched from USS Hornet on that gray morning of April 18, 1942, carried more than bombs. They carried proof that innovation could overcome impossibility. They showed that audacity could defeat certainty. They demonstrated that 80 volunteers could change history in their brief passage over Tokyo. The psychological impact rippled through every aspect of Japanese society and military planning. The strategic consequences shaped every major battle that followed. The human stories continue to inspire decades later. Those bombers flying low over Tokyo's rooftops delivered something far more powerful than explosives. They delivered the message that Japan's island fortress could be penetrated. They proved that America possessed both the technical capability and the will to strike back. They changed the fundamental assumptions on both sides about what was possible in this war. The raid succeeded beyond every measure that mattered strategically. It failed by every measure that mattered humanly for those who paid the ultimate price. That contradiction captures the essential tragedy and triumph of war itself. Victory and defeat intertwined in ways that simple statistics could never reveal.